It's Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. in Switzerland. It's Space Café WebTalk time. Our Space Café WebTalk 33 minutes with Jessy Kate Schingler will begin soon. Thank you for joining us for this exciting and very informative event. We know we have a very informed audience with all of you for this event on a dialogue on lunar policy. As always, we appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback. I'm Thorsten Kriening, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly newsletter, our daily newsletter, and the Space Café podcast. I'm very proud to announce that this morning we published episode 5 of our podcast featuring Simon Gwatch from Equatorial Space Systems in Singapore with the title Simon, the Elon of Singapore. Check it out and leave us your comment at podcast@SpaceWatch.Global. We are keen to get your feedback and your ratings, of course. If you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the event section and now on YouTube as well. We host our Space Café web talks on a weekly basis. This is already the 13th edition. I hope you mark Tuesdays at the same time in your calendar. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by a very special guest, Jessy Kate Schingler. Jessy spent her career at the intersection of space, governance, and technology. She's a computer scientist by training, but has worked in space policy throughout her career. She was one of the original researchers on the Space Security Index project and one of the founding members of the Space Generation Advisory Council at the Space Generation Forum in 1999. As a software engineer, she has worked on distributed systems, large-scale cloud computing at NASA, and in embedded system development, flight software for rockets at Astra Space. She is also active in networked communities with self-governance practice that provide ongoing experience with governance design. Jessy is currently leading policy and governance at the Open Lunar Foundation, bringing her experience in distributed systems and process design to the questions of lunar policy and coordination. Today, she joins us from San Francisco. So thank you for your early start. I'm very proud to welcome Jessy Kate Schingler today. Hello, Jessy Kate.
Hi.
I really enjoyed watching you on YouTube, your talk last December on the Vision Weekend. Great thoughts and highly recommended. And as said earlier, you're the Director of Policy at Open Lunar Foundation. We're talking about lunar governance here. So let's start with the idea that for many, Open Lunar is a myth, something that has been quite some time in stealth mode. Can you tell us a bit about more? Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation, Thorsten. Some folks, as you said, they might be familiar with Open Lunar, mostly from the Bloomberg article that came out about us last year. We, as an organization, were initially focused on building spacecraft, and our thesis was to be an actor who, as a nonprofit, could stand for open and collaborative and cooperative approaches to lunar activity. Our goal was to demonstrate a sub-$10 million mission using an agile approach that's focused on cheap components, best effort, and quick iterations. Just before COVID hit, we decided to revector away from the spacecraft direction. I wish I could say it was COVID, but it was clear that the strategy wasn't going exactly as we thought. There were some real key learnings there. Launch costs were much more expensive than we had initially anticipated. The reusability of existing hardware was less than we thought, and the propulsion options for TLI stage were just not there. So we'll have a big blog post coming out about our learnings from this period, actually, within a month or two. But we did learn a lot from that period, and meanwhile, we became a lot more familiar with the other lunar companies that have, of course, were many years ahead of the efforts that we had undertaken. And we've been engaging a lot with iSpace and Intuitive Machines, who have been great friends and advisors to us. But we realized that if our goal was to advance infrastructure for cooperation on the moon, that we could hitch a ride rather than building the ride ourselves and get more directly to the lunar surface. And we could be a partner rather than a competitor with the existing lander initiatives. And we could focus more directly on cooperative interventions rather than multi-year engineering efforts. So we have been revectoring away from the spacecraft direction. And in doing so, we realized that there's literally no think tank with a dedicated program looking at lunar policy and coordination issues. And there's some really big questions there. No one's really committed to figuring out representation for private or non-state actors, the mechanics of registration and transparency, confidence building measures, remote and proximity operations and standards, reference approaches to property rights that don't involve appropriation. And of course, all the very rich policy questions that are being raised by folks working on the Artemis Accords right now. So we still have an engineering capability in-house, but the focus now is on what we can deploy and operationalize over building from scratch. So that includes open source hardware and software components, payloads that enable cooperation, or even institutions themselves. So besides the more traditional research that looks at coordination and governance, some other examples of work that we've been looking at are navigation and positioning capabilities with retroreflectors, open source hardware components, radios and star trackers, and landing pad designs. Finally, we've also been working on a Salon series that's been really fun. It's called the Moon Dialogs, and it's a partnership with Arizona State University, MIT, the Secure World Foundation, and For All Moonkind. And the goal of that is to create a more peer-based dialogue and thought leadership around near-term lunar policy questions.
That's great. Thank you very much for this lead in. Let's talk about the topic. I mean, we want to exchange some thoughts on the on lunar policy. So let's start with this easy one. So who will rule the moon? I think it's an easy one. At least it's a short one.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I think that rule involves a lot of infrastructure and communication, coordination, obligations. And so the right question is perhaps, how will we constitute or extend the key institutions of society? And there are two fairly common answers to this, right? One is that states will define this, and we should wait for them to come to the table and kind of, tell us how it's going to be. And the other is that no one should do it right now, and it should be a kind of laissez-faire approach, or a first come, first served. And then, of course, there's a spectrum that fits in the middle, in between those two extremes. But especially as we're operating beyond traditional notions of territorial jurisdiction, I think in practice, a lot of this will be defined by the folks who show up. And actually, it's not just that we're beyond traditional notions of territorial jurisdiction, but we're also in an environment that's quite far away operationally from where most states are operating on Earth. So I think we're really going to be seeing an environment that is defined by the folks who show up and those who actually engage in building a vision that goes beyond kind of abstract ideals and do the work to create the basic seeds of mutual commitment and coordination, which is where rules come from.
But if it's driven by the folks that show up there, then it sounds very much like Wild West. So I go there, plant my flag, and that's mine. Is that the model for the future, or what is a lunar governance model for you for the future?
Yeah, good clarifying question. I mean, when I say show up, I mean in the sense of people showing up to this webinar, people showing up to the conversations that need to happen about coordination and governance on the lunar surface. And that's not just actors, that's a variety of stakeholders who show up in a variety of different ways. But for lunar governance of the future, The main thing I would add to the conversation that I think we've all probably had in one way, shape, or form is that I don't think we should be advocating for a single international system. Often we appeal to that because it's familiar and it's legible, but the moon as a whole, it's a whole celestial body with many kinds of resources and hopefully a wide diversity of actors with different priorities and values and interests. And when you combine that with the provisions for open access and non-appropriation in the Outer Space Treaty, I think there's a real opportunity to challenge ourselves to see more of a diversity of governance approaches on the moon, even within the same types of resources. So for example, we often say, how should we manage the PSRs, the permanently shadowed regions? But it's not like all rivers are managed exactly the same way on Earth. Maybe some PSRs will be managed by a consortium of states for science research, and others will be managed as a cooperative basis for a utility company. They just have very different needs, and I think it's important that we make space for those needs. And finally, I would just say that our global institutions on Earth are also really struggling right now with the exact same questions in many respects that the moon forces us to interrogate. Where borders are becoming less meaningful, people are more fluid across those borders. And when you have domains such as the internet or climate that aren't subject to familiar Western notions of appropriation and therefore sovereignty, how do you construct good governance? So I'd like to see us, personally, I'd like to see us create room for what is called a polycentric approach, one that has many centers and that defers to a local level wherever possible, relying on global scale institutions where necessary. So not to say that that's not part of the tool set that we have at our disposal, but I think that balance would recognize specific areas of interdependence and public goods while allowing for experimentation and diversity.
So just to clarify, what is good governance for you? What is the threshold? What are the values you put in here for a good governance?
What is good governance? I would say it has to do with creating agency for stakeholders, a way for in the case of space activities on the moon, I think it's very important that we see not just state actors having a voice. Of course, states should have a voice, but I think so should others, and not just operators, but also various members of the public and civil society. I mentioned this, but I think plurality is an important value that we should strive for when we get to the moon. Mobility and access are sort of contained again in the OST, but as a value, you can see how this can inform the design of coordination and institutions. Experimentation as a value, that we can be principled and rigorous in our experimentation with new approaches to coordination and decision making. And then I guess I'd just say emphasis on a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach where we're practical.
So, but it all potentially in a remote controlled area. I mean, it's not likely that we have a huge, not for me likely, a huge permanent human presence on the moon. So we will have a handful potentially, and then the rest are robots. I mean, I referred to this or earlier to this talk, which is on YouTube, where you say, hey, the Outer Space Treaty is for you one of the greatest documents, one of the most radical jurisdiction ever built. Yeah. So is that still en vogue, or is it a model we can try to apply for the moon? And I mean, when we talk about moon, and at least that's my understanding, it is a proxy for anything else, an asteroid, Mars, whatever. If we want to go that far, are you agreeing on that, or has the moon a special value or a special place there?
I think it's both. So to speak to the Outer Space Treaty, absolutely. I think the Outer Space Treaty is not only important because that it is the defining international agreement that we have to govern outer space and celestial bodies, but also, as I mentioned, the access provision and the non-appropriation provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, they, on some level, I mean, this is intentionally extreme read of the Outer Space Treaty, but those two provisions kind of undermine some of the core tenets of international law as we have defined it. And that's actually potentially really interesting because it forces us to step back and look at new ways of forming agreements with one another. So again, in an environment where the way we form agreements is sort of showing itself to have some real challenges, I think that's the intersection of those things is where we have an opportunity to at least try things in a new way. It's not that the Outer Space Treaty doesn't provide some challenges of its own, but I think that we should see it as an opportunity.
That's interesting. So when you say we have to have agreements among each other, is it more these, on one extreme, the Artemis Accord way? So if you want to do something on the moon, talk to us, or at NASA, talk to us in the US, or is it more the OST approach, ruled, governed, controlled by the UNOSA or COPIUS, and then you make your agreement with that entity by applying to their rules? Because these are two different approaches, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, with the Artemis Accords, I think that there's a lot of important work and thinking that has gone into efforts for the Artemis Accords. So, partially I guess I feel many things about them, but one is just that, the folks at NASA and the State Department who are working on this right now are creating more movement in space policy and lunar policy than we've seen in many decades. So I think they're imperfect, but I also just want to, acknowledge them for trying to kind of move the needle forward in one way, shape, or form. To me, the contents of the Artemis Accords feel appropriate and timely. The big question with them is really one of international participation and kind of open participation. And it's hard to imagine how topics like deconfliction and safety zones or registration even work in a way that would, speak to the underlying goals of those principles if we don't have open participation from all actors. And if it's hard to imagine those actors participating if they're not involved in the dialogue about the implementation.
We will come to safety zones in a minute, because I had to promise that we talk about that here in that forum. Yeah, in the talk with Caio Schrogel, it was mentioned a few times, and he didn't go to this level. But here we talk about really a concrete example. So, but taking one step back, you as Open Lunar, with the initiative you do, how will you include international partners? Are you welcoming them? Are you doing it, hey, that's our closed shop, invitation only, or teaming, or what is your idea behind it?
Well, first I'll say that international partnership is something that we're very passionate about, and it's something that we need to work on. We're an international team. We do have some Americans on the team, but we also have a Canadian, myself, and a New Zealand individual. So, we would love to create more partnerships with Europe and with China in particular, as well as with commercial actors, so that we can see forums that represent a much wider diversity of perspectives. And when you're based physically in a place, it's hard not to be sort of weighted towards the inputs and outputs of that place. But I do think we need ways to show up to the table as peers, no matter where we're from. And again, if we're a state or a private actor. And, we're seeing Because I would just say discrimination based on birth is something that I think we'll look back on with shame in 100 years in human society, and so we should reflect that in our approach to coordination for future governance systems, whether on Earth or the Moon. Anyway, so back to actual international cooperation. Yeah. A real issue implicit in that is, in my opinion, is how we handle distributive justice when there is an unequal allocation of capability and resources between the actors who are interested in or going to the Moon. So I won't pretend to know how we solve that, but my gut is again to appeal to a regime that supports plurality where we can, and know that there's different approaches to cost and benefit sharing where we don't always need universal answers. So, rather than one approach to rule them all, I think part of it involving and speaking to the different needs of the international community is making room for different approaches. But I think that's very important, and it should be the foundation, the bedrock of how we design the governance regimes for the Moon.
Okay. So, but to be clear on that, I mean, how do you see the current value now of UNOSA, the Outer Space Treaty, that of course was at the forefront, 67? I mean, yeah. So early that nobody could think of what we are experiencing right now. At least I couldn't. So, but next question with that, what does it mean in practice? How can we get the ball rolling, and how will we define then behaviors? I mean, we have the discussion with the RPOs in low Earth orbit, rendezvous proximity,
right.
Operations was missing. Yeah, I mean, we can continue that on AI. You talked about in YouTube about algorithms that will cause problems because they will not be standardized, and so on and so forth. So there's a long chain on that. So, but again, I think for all of them, the big question is how can we implement it into praxis?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned UNOSA, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think an emphasis on a bottom-up approach doesn't mean no international or UN involvement at all. What I think it means is prototyping locally and seeing where there are shared or universal values, and that secondly, that when we do have formal international or treaty conversations, that we have something to actually point to for lived experience to inform the design of those agreements. So I think there's a huge role to play for treaties, for transparency, and for, as I've emphasized, open conversations. But it's also not the only tool in the toolbox. And sometimes I think what happens is that we defer to that because the alternative is kind of constructing something from scratch outside of the familiar institutions that we are used to working with. So in practice, I think it's as simple and as complicated as getting people together around a table and talking about the real challenges and incentives that they are experiencing, and designing shared agreements and norms that speak to those challenges, and and preparing for learnings from testing them and iteration, and eventually kind of bringing together the local experimentation or agreements between operators and the formal international community.
Does it include one step back? I mean, the point when we, let's talk now about safety zone. Is it simplified? I place my lander wherever I want to place it on the Moon and put my fence around it, and I define the fence. So, I mean, is it that simple? Is it that the idea behind? And if you say, hey, we have to review it, and maybe reiterate, does it or can mean, hey, I have to remove my lander? I mean, the follow-up question with that is then who will an enforcement can look like? I mean, I know these very complex question for this short for this short talk. But I mean, I think the aim is to create food for thoughts here.
Right. So I mean, you might have seen I had a piece in the Space Review a couple of weeks ago on safety zones. But you know, my hunch is that area-based definitions aren't really a complete mechanism for defining deconfliction, and that there are deconfliction elements that are not physical, such as spectrum, and some that are not local area-based, such as dust effects. And there are some that involve interaction between actors and some that involve relationships to specific resources. And in general, they will need to be mobile. So, you know, I think we end up conflating a lot of different things when we talk about safety zones. And it goes back to the principle of specificity, that we should let deconfliction focus on deconfliction, and have, you know, think about resource management and priority rights and, you know, all these other kind of areas that idea seeps into as different conversations. And when it comes to enforcement, you know, there are a variety of different approaches to handling enforcement. One is that, especially in an environment where we cannot appeal to the same tools of enforcement as the international community. I think well-designed protocols that are rooted in incentives design is, of course, the ideal. I mean, it's not always possible. It's just that recognizing that we can use incentives to create, that we can incentivize participation, voluntary participation in regimes, is an important starting point. But we also know that enforcement mechanisms are very important to governance regimes, and we need to be able to have, you know, there's carrot and stick. So maybe it sounds a bit too abstract, but on some level, even a nation is just an imagined community that only works because we collectively consent into it. So it's not that it's not magical, it's just hard work.
Okay. So how do we move forward from here? I mean, we will expect, well, I think we can expect successful missions on the moon end of this year, potentially next year, with a few of the private actors that are out there. So, and then we have set facts. So can we, how do we move there? How can we accelerate this process? Because what you described is potentially a very long-lasting diplomatic discussion we will have, and just seeing the the adaptation of the 21 long-term sustainability guidelines at the UN level that just took 10 years. So 10 years, I think, on the moon we don't have, because then we have a polluted and potential conflict zone or in the night sky.
Yeah. So I think you know, the first and most important thing is that we need to build capacity in lunar policy thought leadership. There's just not that many people thinking about this right now, and so it's hard to come up with suggestions or counterpoints to, you know, say there's 5 people working on the Artemis Accords in a back room somewhere. You know, we really need to develop our own thinking collectively about how the implementation of these principles might proceed. And the second is that I believe we should be creating fora that recognize all actors and operators as peers along with states, and to create kind of specific agreements and norms amongst those actors as a way to prototype new governance approaches and coordination. And then I think we need to just hold a lot of space for plurality, for innovation, and be willing to have some discussions about compromise and sharing as well.
Okay, let's take our look at the time. Okay, we have our 1-2 more minutes. So I would like to take one of the questions here from the audience, or from Simon. Would a central registry of lunar locations, public, private, heritage, and community be workable across multiple governing bodies? How do you see that?
I get so one can answer this as a technology question or a human social question, and both have rich answers. Central registry is used for, of course, objects being launched from Earth already. And I think it will play a very important role in transparency and confidence building measures for the moon as well. I think we're likely to see that we need that regime to evolve, not just having a registration of objects, but a registration of activities will bring much more visibility into what's happening on the lunar surface, and I think, again, build a lot of confidence in people's understanding of what other actors are doing. From an implementation standpoint, it is it's one of where does the database of this information live, and how do we trust that that database is accurate, and what mechanisms do we use to keep it updated? Are there requirements to update it? Is it voluntary? What's the frequency, and what's the mechanism? What is the sort of beacon technology that we're using in order to announce and record position? I mean, there's a lot of really interesting questions associated with that.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a handful more questions, which I will send over to you. That would be great to answer them then or in writing. So I'm afraid we have to come to an end, or as our 33 minutes are taken already. Even so, I would enjoy continuing this exciting talk because it's a fascinating topic. Be sure that we will follow up on lunar topics in our future Space Café web talk and on our magazines, or on our scheduled on our scheduler. There are a number of people that will cover this topic here as well. Two special events we plan for you are there will be a special edition of our 33 minutes with on the asteroid day on the 13th of June, in the morning with Michael Kuipers, our mission scientist from the Hera mission from ESA. This event will be hosted by the voice of our Space Café podcast, Markus Moslechner. And also on the 30th of June, after our regular web talk, we will facilitate an web talk for Serbian Case for Space, on how to start your career in the space industry with Anja Pekulčić, or if I pronounce it correctly. But this event will be in Serbian language for all of you that are able to speak and understand Serbian language. Our regular next webinars are on the 13th of June. Dr. Bledin Bowen will be my guest to have a chat about his new book, War in Space, Strategy, Superpowers, and Geopolitics. On the 7th of July, Sebastian Moranta from ESPI will talk about the status of the European space industry after COVID-19. And I'm happy to announce today that on 14th of July, I will have Jenny Tapio, the space specialist at the Finnish government, will talk with me about implementation of national space law for Finland and beyond. This is a conversation I'm very proud of and I'm looking forward to, because it connects direct what we just discussed, the need of governing models. All these events are online on Eventbrite as usual. As always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up for our daily or bi-weekly newsletters, and we really need your support also as potential sponsors of these web talks. So please get in touch with us. Thank you very much for your interest today, and thank you, Jessy Kate, for this exciting talk. I think you give us a lot of food for thoughts of what can we do to really move that forward. And I'm happy to also provide links to the Moon Dialogue, and the upcoming one is a quite interesting one, and these saloons you're running with your team. And thank you again for my entire team behind the scenes for doing that great job week by week again. I hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. In the meantime, visit our website, or follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jessy Kate. Bye-bye.